Good Friday morning to everyone. I'm so glad you're able to join me today for the Friday Forum. We're looking forward to talking about a topic that is very much on all of our minds, and that is test optional. What do we do with our students? Do we recommend that they take the test or not? What does this do to test preparation? What is test optional truly? This topic came up in our recent forum. So I've asked a expert to join me. He's having a little bit of technical difficulties. So we're going to, hopefully he'll be able to join me here in just a few minutes. But while we're doing that, I'd love to learn a little bit more. Use your chat button, as we always do, on my Friday forums. Let us know where you're at and where you're joining me from, okay? And then everybody can see. Make sure you change your selection from panelists to panelists and attendees. That way, everybody can see. So go back in. If it doesn't say panelists and attendees on the chat, please make sure you change it, because it's very helpful for all of you. I know we've all been on several. There's Tom. Good afternoon. So we've all been on several webinars. I know I've done quite a few this week, and you always feel like, there's other people out there, but who are they and where are they coming from? I did one with Zoom, and she said, "Oh, we've got 3,000 people on this." Like, okay, but so I see we've got Diana back again. We're glad to have you from Venezuela, Orlando, Florida, Portland, Oregon, Texas. Oh, we're so glad. We hope you guys are doing better. Seattle, Westlake, Sacramento, Bay Area, Providence, Rhode Island, Toronto, London. We're glad to have you here, Mary. So thank you, everyone. We had almost 300 people sign up for this webinar. So I expect there'll be about close to 100 people joining us today. So we're very glad to have the opportunity to talk about these different topics. And I will give you a list where I'm starting to get all my Friday forums lined up. In 2 weeks, we're going to have Jenna Hartzell is going to come and talk about the UK system and UCAS. And if we can get someone from the UCAS to join us, we will. We're working on that. And also, we're going to have another consultant talk about how to build your practice online. There's a new equity index. I just talked to Sydney Montgomery about this recently, and it's going live on Sunday. And so she's going to come in April and speak. So put Friday forums on your calendars. We're going to do them twice a month, and I'm setting up a schedule. So watch my website for those dates. And of course, I'll always send you emails to send this. And these are always recorded as podcasts as well, so that you can catch them at your convenience later on or re-listen. So, hi, Tom. Glad to see you.
Hey, Cindy. Sorry about that. I don't know why I'm East Coast. I thought it was 2 p.m. Pacific, so sorry about that.
Oh, no, 2 p.m. your time. So 11 o'clock our time. So we're glad to have you. So, Tom, give us a little bit of background, share with everybody a little bit about your history. You're the founder and CEO of Method Learning, I see, is your name is changed. So that sounds exciting. And you have quite a background in history when it comes to education and test preparation. So why don't you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my parents spent their whole careers as teachers in a high school here on Long Island. And back in 1998, I was just graduating college, and I had done the teacher preparation program at Princeton, and I was actually teaching 5th grade. And they said, we have a lot of students here who are not doing well on the SAT and ACT. Maybe you could help. And I started tutoring students, and within about 5 seconds, it was that feeling of, my goodness, these students are going into these tests without any tricks, any strategies, any techniques. they have no idea how to handle the timing aspect of the program. And in many cases, they don't even know what they're being tested on. They didn't even know the content. And their basic reading comprehension skills were very weak. They had many gaps in their math understanding of math concepts. And so it was, at the end of the hour, the student would say thank you. The parent would say thank you. The parent would say, would you like a chicken cutlet Parmesan hero? And I said, that's it. I'm doing this all day, every day. For a decade, all day, every day, I just tutored students. And I share some of that history, Cindy, just because, so I've been doing this now for 22 years. And in many respects, so much has changed over the last 22 years. And obviously this pandemic has upended every aspect of life for all of us. But in some respects, nothing has changed, because like I just talked to a parent 20 minutes ago, and the parent said, Tom, I have no idea what to do about the SAT and ACT. I feel like I'm at a complete loss. I'm very stressed out. My son and daughter is stressed out. Just give us some info, give us some guidance, right? And so again, that's the exact same call that I got in 1998. And so I'm really excited to talk about all the changes that have gone on, whether it's test optional or no more essay, no more SAT2s. But I always want to just, I guess, remind everybody that in a lot of respects, nothing has changed. And the last thing I'll say, Cindy, before we jump on to the next thing is, students have always, there's just been such a fear factor around these tests. There's been so much anxiety. And so, of course, students are like, oh, maybe I just don't have to take the SAT or ACT. Like, that would solve one of my problems, right? But the reality is, for most students, they're probably still going to have to take the SAT or ACT. I mean, if they want to apply to a range of competitive colleges, if they want to be eligible for as much academic merit aid as possible. So, sorry, that was a very kind of long-winded about my background.
Well, no, I think it gives really relevant information and gives a foundation for why this is an important topic, why you have a passion for this, and why you're an expert in this area. So, as you mentioned, this year has been upended because of COVID. And so many colleges went test optional or have said they're test blind. And they're going to continue that for the class of 2021 that's applying. So our rising seniors, our juniors right now. With that in mind, should the students still be preparing for standardized tests? And which ones, what schedule? Those are the questions we have as advisors.
And I'm sure, Cindy, my assumption is there's going to be a lot of follow-up questions in the chat, and I'm sure you do this on every webinar that you host. Please, everybody, keep the chat questions coming in, because even just in that one question you just asked, there's so much to unpack, right, Cindy? And the first thing to unpack is the phrase test optional, right? Which means you don't have to submit scores, but if you do submit scores, we are going to take that into consideration. And then what's so frustrating for all of us is, what exactly does that mean, right? And so I was on a panel last night, and it was mostly it was a panel for high school parents and students, and it was all representatives from colleges. And then I was sort of the only person, a little weird, I was the only person who was not a rep from a college. And the point of sharing is each rep gave a completely different answer as far as what test optional means at their school, right? University of Connecticut was on, Stony Brook University was on, just to name a couple. And like one school said, hey, we're going to be test optional for next year, but if you're applying to one of our medical programs or applying to one of our other programs, then you still have to submit scores. And of course, again, you don't have to submit scores, but if you do submit scores, we're going to take those into consideration. And if you submit strong scores, of course, that's going to influence our decision, right? So again, most parents I talk to, they're not even sure what test optional means. And maybe for all of us on this call, we all understand what it means, but parents hear test optional and they think, oh, then SAT or ACT scores just don't matter, or you have an equal chance of getting in whether you submit scores or not, which, by the way, may be true at some schools, but is certainly not going to be true at other schools.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's the big debate, right? What is the difference between test optional and test blind? I mean, here in California, we've had quite a controversy and, an upheaval, because all of a sudden the CSUs, the community California state universities, are quote unquote test blind, and the UCs are supposed to be test blind, but are they really? They went test optional this year, but and then their position is, well, maybe we'll write our own test. So, what is the difference between test optional and test blind?
Yeah, sure. So test blind is, we're not even going to look at test scores. You can submit them, but we're not going to look at them. There's really no point. So test blind, it seems pretty black and white that not taking SAT or ACT at a test blind school, that's not going to hurt your chances. But the vast majority of schools are test optional, right? And some were test optional last year, but they're not going to be test optional for this next class. Whereas some schools have already said, we've chosen that we're going to continue our test optional policy. We already know we're going to be test optional for the next year, or 2 years, or 3 years. But again, it's still, if you submit scores, we're going to take those into consideration.
So then that becomes the question of how you determine what good scores are. And if you take the SAT or ACT and don't get good scores, then can you choose not to submit them and just go test optional? Because so many colleges, especially the highly selective ones, are saying, they don't observe score choice. So if you take them, then you're supposed to submit them. Is that correct or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all trying to figure that out right now, and unfortunately, I mean, there may be somebody on this webinar today who has more information on that than me, because what I just keep hearing is it's so case by case. It's really hard to it's hard to advise students, given the fact that most students are going to apply to a range of schools, right? So, I mean, like, when any of us are talking to the folks that trust us, right? So for most of us, we're talking to parents and students, families. I'm talking to counselors at schools all day, every day. And so the thing is, you have to be careful about how far into the weeds you get, right? So so they're coming to me and asking for my advice. Now, our son and our daughter are in 6th grade. So no, I have not started SAT prep and ACT prep with them yet. But we're not that far behind, right? So it's not hard for me to imagine having an 11th grader. If my son or daughter were in 11th grade, I mean, they would be taking the SAT or ACT. I mean, and I would be helping them prepare to do well. And really, I guess it goes back to my passion, which is most students can be more successful on these tests than they think. So for me, that's the interesting part. That's the fun part, is helping a student. You asked earlier, what is a good score? And, of course, I just say, hey, good is a relative term. You want to score at least at the average. And of course, you want to try to, for that school, right? You can just Google average SAT scores. So, my son or my daughter would be preparing. And again, I'm passionate that kids can be more successful than they think. A fact that I love to share, Cindy, I know you've heard this from me before, and maybe the majority of the audience knows this, but each question you get right in the SAT is 10 more points on your score. So if you get 5 more grammar questions, 5 more math, and 5 more reading, that's a 150-point improvement in your score. I'm very passionate and confident that students can do that. So to me, it's like, let's get started doing that rather than spending 10 hours trying to figure out where is the score going to matter, how much is it going to matter. Nobody wants these tests to dominate a student's junior or senior year. That's absurd. We want to be efficient about it. And so it shouldn't dominate time-wise. This doesn't need to cost thousands and thousands of dollars. But, and again, and I'm happy to either debate or maybe everyone in this webinar is just like, duh, Tom. The stuff on the SAT and ACT, these are fundamental skills that you need for success in college. I mean, it's reading comprehension, it's basic grammar, it's math skills that you'll need not only for college but for the rest of your life. So I really enjoy every hour that I'm with a student. I really enjoy showing them these types of skills because yes, I'm going to help them score higher on the SAT or ACT, but for me, it's not about that. For me, it's these are things you need to know anyway. And listen, I'm not going to take my chances that I don't need SAT or good SAT or ACT scores. I'm going to go and get those scores, and then this way, worst case scenario is for some of the schools I applied to, it's not going to matter. But best case scenario is I'm giving myself an advantage, not only about as far as getting in, but then of course a larger academic merit aid package.
And that's kind of what our approach is as educators and advisors is let's give you all these options, have all the eggs in one basket, and then if you don't need them, then that's fine. But that can be really important to have. So it sounds like test preparation is still something we should be having our students do. And the schedule though, because right now, like in California, I know of many of my students haven't been able to take a test since last January, and our schools are still not open. And so I've had one student been able to take an essay or an ACT in February in a neighboring community. None of them took PSATs. I don't think any of them offered PSATs. So what schedule are we looking at?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting because California, right out of all 50 states, California is almost in a little bit of a unique situation in the sense of, like you said, the California State University decisions, and then just not being able to take the test. So certainly, my advice to a family in California, I think, would be a little different, just because of what you just referenced. Like, so I'm on Long Island, and I've never advised a family to drive off of Long Island to take the SAT or ACT. That just seems to me to be, absurd. So like, I wouldn't tell a family in California to go drive 3 hours, to go take an SAT or ACT. Now, having said that, Cindy, 2 days ago, I had back-to-back calls scheduled on my calendar, and I was busy, so I didn't get a chance to look. And it just happened that they were both California parents. And they both started off the conversation the exact same way. They said, Tom, my son, my daughter is in a situation, they need to take the SAT or ACT, and they need to do well. How can you help me? And of course, the one thing I can't do is make a test center be open, right? But the point is, these are California parents who are they're not deciding whether to take the SAT or ACT. They're not deciding, they're not in their mind, there's no question about whether it's important, right? And they're just asking me for advice on the best way to prepare. But I guess, sorry, Cindy, it's a tough question for me to answer because the piece you brought up is the piece that none of us can solve, right? Like,
right.
you have to have an open test center, or you have to be willing to drive a long way, which it's just that part does drive me crazy. And that is something that obviously in 22 years, I've never had to deal with to this extent. So.
Oh, definitely. So, we've got a couple of questions, and now if you do have questions, put them in the question box as well. If it's a short question, you can put it in the chat, but if it's something that if we don't get a chance to get to, go ahead and put it in the question box, because then I am able to see your email and I can respond back to you. But, with this, so many parents and we as advisors depend on SAT and ACT distribution ranges. When the colleges publish their data and say, okay, here's the SAT range or ACT range of our students, Mary's asking, will median scores as reported by the colleges go sky high? Because at the test optional schools, students are only reporting their scores that have the good scores.
Yeah, I think that's likely, and I think we're going to see a lot of wacky changes in average scores and things like that. I think that yes, probably, and I don't enjoy getting into how do I say this, like trying to game the system or game the understanding. I am so I spend 24/7, Cindy, trying to figure out how to help more kids get better scores, and so these strategic questions are very important, and I understand, but for me it's just how do we help a student get a better score more efficiently. But yes, average scores are just going to get wacky over the next couple of years.
And how are colleges going to use those, like even PSAT scores, to drive admissions decisions? Have you heard them talk about that, or?
No, it's a good question. I would be surprised if colleges use PSAT scores, because that's really it's really been explicitly stated for a long time that PSAT scores will never be used as a factor. But look, after what we've all been through over the last year, I guess nothing's off the table.
Well, and that's why, as more and more colleges are saying they're going test optional, and they have holistic review, but like NYU, their application pool, doubled. I talked to a LA Times reporter in December, and they're noticing at all these applications, the number of applications, like to the University of California, increased, and like the California State Universities decreased. So students are taking advantage and feeling, as you said, like, oh, I don't have to take a test, therefore maybe my chances of getting admitted are higher now. And so the colleges, if they don't have a test score, like the reason they use standardized tests is to give some kind of universal, equitable standard, right? That everybody takes the same SAT, then you have a score that you can rely on. GPAs are very much inflated, and it all depends on the school, the program, the student. So those aren't as reliable in terms of consistency. Although there are many studies that show they're more predictable than an SAT score. But so if they don't have the SAT or ACT, are they going to go more toward AP scores? The subject tests are going to be removed. That's going to make an impact with a lot of schools. The writing has been removed. So what's going to become that new measure?
Yeah, and again, that's why I think ultimately most colleges will continue to use the SAT or ACT as one factor for exactly what you just said. Now, will AP tests become more important? I think that's likely to happen. But yeah, at any college where any competitive college or colleges where they're seeing their application numbers rise, obviously you would want more data points rather than less data points to help decide. That would seem to be the fairest way and would give the admissions officers, just, more of an insight. So yeah, so I absolutely, I think they're going to start looking at AP scores more, but I think they're going to, they're still going to need the SAT or ACT. I mean, to think that there's going to be some other test that comes along, I mean, that's just ludicrous. The amount of data and history that the College Board and ACT, I think it's just, yeah, like I said, it's just silly to think that you could come along and make a better test.
So you don't think the greatest public institution in the world can come along and do better than the SAT or ACT?
I mean, the one thing that I've always said, like, and again, I don't want to take up everyone's time. It's just like, if you actually sit and take the SAT or ACT, like, these are skills that high school kids should know. I mean, these are things that you need to know. These are fundamental skills. So you could make another test that tests kids on the same stuff, but but then you're just kind of just putting a new skin on the same thing. So what you said, Cindy, is right on. I mean, and so how can we even evaluate? I mean, I know everyone's thought this, like, how can we even evaluate extracurricular activities when they haven't happened in the last year? And I see what goes on with my son and my daughters. I mean, my wife was like, "Oh, the kids' report cards just came out." I'm like, so, like, they're in school half the days. I see what my son and my daughter do. Like, to me, the grades are it's ludicrous. Like, so I don't think grades are more telling now than they were pre-COVID.
Well, and that's very, very true, especially with the whole transitions to online learning, and that's been a very uneven process. And we can spend a lot of time just on a session on that. So Kate asks, is the SAT actually a skills-based test?
I mean, you start getting into semantics, but my answer would be yes, in the sense that the first skill for the SAT and ACT is reading comprehension, right? So reading comprehension, that's a whole set of skills. So those are skills that any student can improve upon. They need to be taught, and they need practice and repetition. Then it's math, certainly fundamental math skills, percents, ratios, proportions, equations. Well, then grammar, I don't know if you call it skills, it's grammar, it's understanding the rules. But I think it's a really interesting question, Cindy, because I've gotten the question thousands of times over the years, is it more test-taking strategies and tips and tricks, or is it more like content? And my answer is it's about 80% content, and it's about 20% test-taking tricks or strategies. And what I mean by that is, we know that students are going to, just use an example, we know students are going to be tested on exponents. You have to understand the rules of exponents. You have to understand how to work with exponents. So I spend a lot of time teaching students, making sure that they understand, what exponents are, how they work, and how you're going to be tested on exponents on the SAT and ACT, because there are predictable ways. And then the second and final example I'll give is subject-verb agreement. We know students are going to be tested on subject-verb agreement. That's a concept, that's a grammar rule. Now, if somebody wants to call that a test-taking strategy, that's fine, and I don't have a problem with it. But it's a skills-based test. Of course, there are some test-taking strategies, but the bulk of it is understanding or being fluent with the skills.
So how is the ACT different from the SAT? Is that basically the same for the ACT then as well?
There's a couple of interesting. So on the answer is yes, but on the SAT, 2 of the 4 sections are math sections. Right? On the ACT, 1 of the 4 sections is a math section. So when you think about it, that's a very significant difference. So one thing I like to tell people is, look, if you're stronger in math than you are in English, you may feel more comfortable with the SAT because 50% of your score is going to come down to how you perform in the math sections. On the other hand, if you're stronger in English than you are in math, I want you to go into the ACT with a chip on your shoulder. And what I mean by that is you're going to have the ACT English section where they basically test you on the same 11 grammar rules over and over again. So if you're a strong English student, you can study those rules, you can memorize those rules, you can do very well in that section. Then you have the ACT reading section where all of the answers are in the passages. You just have to, again, get fluent about going back and finding the answers, right? Which is the most important skill any of us could have as far as education and learning goes. So if you're a strong English student, you can learn to do very well on that section because you can go back in the passage, find the answers. And then you have the ACT science section where it's really just reading comprehension because they're giving you all the information. They give you a chart, a graph, or a table, and you're pulling information out of what they give you. The shame is most students don't understand what the science section is, and they get very intimidated by the science section. They're thinking of it as like an outlier, when in reality, it's just another English section. So now think of it as 75% of your ACT score is really just coming down to your reading comprehension or your English ability. And when you present it to students that way, it completely changes their mindset, their attitude. And again, for kids who are strong in English, it makes them more confident, more motivated, more optimistic, and it becomes that virtuous cycle where they start to believe like, wait, if I put in a few hours, I can make a big difference in my score. And that to me is the key, is getting kids to realize even a small number of hours preparing for the SAT or ACT can have a significant effect. So no one's telling anybody that they're going to have to spend 100 hours studying for the SAT or ACT. That, to me, that's the happy medium here, Cindy. It's not don't bother taking the SAT or ACT, and it's not think of the SAT or the ACT as the be all and end all, which is, it's never been like that. These tests shouldn't determine your future, and they're not going to determine your future. But you could put in 10 or 15 hours and make a significant difference in your score and end up with a decent score. So, sorry, you asked a really important question, and then I kind of went on a little bit of a tangent, but just to go back to the question, yes, the ACT is a skill-based test, and I do have to say, in case there's anybody on who is not aware, the challenge with the ACT, of course, is the timing. You get less time per question, and you have to move very quickly. And if you haven't taken a timed practice ACT, you are going to really struggle on the official exam because you just have to move so quickly.
So that leads to a couple other questions, and we've got quite a few questions coming in. Is one exam more favorable? Eleanor asks, is one exam more favorable for students whom English is their second language?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know what? I don't want to say because I don't have any data or evidence. And I would be actually really curious if somebody knows of any data or evidence out there. I feel confident that students where English is not their native language, I feel confident that they can improve equally on both tests. But I wouldn't want to just say I think one test would be an easier one to improve on or to score higher on.
Well, I know, and this was in the past, because before the SAT made the major changes that they made in 2016, but with our students in the AVID program that I worked with here in California, the AVID program often recommended students do the ACT over the SAT, and many of them were, English was their second language, and we found that predominantly they did much better on the ACT. I mean, there's always, because it was better, straightforward. It was there weren't as much it seems, and this is another one of the questions, you look at cultural biases, that are, and that's part of the problem with creating your own tests, is you're always going to have these inherent cultural biases that come into the questions and how they're worded and composed and things like that. And for our students, it seemed like those cultural biases were less on the ACT than on the SAT. But since 2016, the tests have aligned more closely. There's not as much differences between them. I don't know. I have not heard of data that supports that since then, but I do know we recommended both tests, but predominantly we saw our students do better on the ACT. So I remember a conversation one time about a question that was one on the sample test, as they always do they're not releasing, they're testing their questions. And so they had one question about regattas and, boats and sailing. And they had another question that was about cattle lowing. And the students, like rural students and agricultural students, they know what cattle lowing means. But the students who answered the questions about the regattas and sailings had no idea. So guess which question they threw out? The one about cattle lowing. So you just see that there is that cultural bias there. So do you know about test accommodations and the difference between the College Board and ACT? Have you worked with students in that regard? And do you have any recommendations or suggestions in that regard, Tom?
Well, yeah. So the answer is yes. I mean, literally thousands of students where I've had to kind of get personally involved. And the biggest suggestion is what I find in the majority of cases is students who deserve extra time, something in their IP, or they get extra time for tests in school. Students who deserve extra time, typically they ultimately get the extra time they deserve, but it can be a process. So the biggest piece of advice is when you're entitled to extra time, you just have to start that process with your counselor as early as possible. Ultimately, students, I find, do get that extra time. Sometimes it takes longer with the College Board. Sometimes it takes longer with the ACT. But it does add an entire additional element of stress, because sometimes the student gets denied at first. They have to submit, additional paperwork. And look, again, this is, Cindy, this is advice that's almost pre-pandemic. And the reason I say that is it's been very frustrating for everybody. The terrible customer support that so many people have received from College Board and from ACT. And so, like, before the pandemic, it was like, go into your counseling office, or call the counseling office, say that you're going to be taking the SAT in 6 months, you're planning to. Make sure you start to line up extra time. And if you plan ahead, then you typically, like I say, get the extra time. But of course now it's like, we've all heard the stories, and many of us unfortunately have been part of the stories of being on hold for hours with the College Board.
Yep. Yeah, that's very true. And that's one of the things that I cover in my UCLA class too, is, the students with learning differences. And it is important that you start early and build those relationships. And they can't all of a sudden just come say, I'm going to take a test, and then say, okay, I want to have accommodations. It's very hard to get that at that last minute. I want to draw attention to, looks like in the chat, and thank you everybody for adding to the chat. This is what this is all about. We all contribute and help each other. And I love seeing you talk to each other. But looks like Diana, and she's in Venezuela, her Spanish speaking students do well on the SAT. Michelle says her Chinese students whose native language is Chinese do better on the SAT. And for probably the reason that you just stated, and and Diana says there's less English on the SAT than there is. And and I had never really thought about it, but your point is the ACT is like 75% English now. And so that can make a really big difference. So Allie says she had an excellent customer service from College Board, so that's good. And working on the accommodations.
Yeah, and it is interesting because again, yeah, look, nobody's intention is to kind of throw anybody under the bus.
No.
During this pandemic. What's been interesting is, Cindy, I have heard from people who said, one time I called ACT and I got the most unbelievably helpful person. And it's just frustrating that was like that was like their fifth time they called the ACT. The first 4 times they couldn't get through, but the fifth time, person was wonderful, answered all their questions. So anyhow.
So do you have a list, like on your website, do you keep a list of the test optional colleges that said that they're going to be test optional in the next year, Tom?
We don't, because, some of those some of those lists exist, but then they have to be updated all of the time, right? I mean, even last night on the panel, a number of colleges said we still haven't decided. So it just, we don't keep a list.
Okay. And then the other question for a lot of students and comes up, and it's not new to the pandemic. When you're a test optional school, sometimes, as you said, you might be test optional except for applying to special programs. Like I had a student applying to BSMD. Well, his were not test optional. And merit scholarships is another one. And so do you find the frequency, have you seen a change in the number of colleges that require test scores to be considered for merit scholarships?
Yes, I mean, and I think, I know a lot of folks on this webinar, again, are well versed in this, but the whole financial piece of colleges has changed so much just in the last couple of years, right? And one phenomenon is different colleges that really want to attract, students from a certain geography or just any group of students. And so they're offering more attractive merit aid packages, right? And then that happens, and I don't want to name names because it's not about that. It's going on all over the place, right? But then they're starting to get real good at attracting students from a certain place. And then it's almost like the colleges from that part of the country are like, fighting back, and they start offering. And the point that parents don't understand is that it's not a black or white, like you're either getting $0 or you're getting a full ride. What it is
right.
You have a certain academic profile, which of course was dependent on 2 things, your GPA and your SAT or ACT scores. And based on that academic profile, that determined how attractive you were to that college. And therefore that determined what kind of academic merit aid package you were going to be. So of course, over the years, so many families have come to us and said, we were accepted to the college, and we were told if we score a little higher on the SAT or ACT, we're going to get $5,000 more. Now, that over the course of 4 years, that's $20,000. So of course, it's like the parents are like, Tom, can you please help my son or daughter? They just need 50 more points. That's 5 more questions, and they're going to get an extra $5,000 a year. So, I mean, that's been going on forever, but it's going on more now, especially as we're all aware. Applications at many schools are down, so they want to attract more students, et cetera. But so yeah, it's a very interesting conversation, Cindy. But again, in some ways, it hasn't changed. If you score higher on the SAT or ACT, you have a better chance of earning a larger academic merit aid package.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of advisors and parents especially sometimes don't know that even after you've been admitted in the spring of your senior year, you can still go take the SAT or ACT and oftentimes raise your score, and that raises the amount of scholarship. But that's a scholarship that's pegged on those SAT or ACT scores. And, it seems like the emphasis on it is diminishing. And so will we see colleges going away from offering scholarships just based on, oh, you got a 1,200, 1,300, 1,400 on the tests?
No, they're going to continue to use the SAT and ACT for. Now, listen, of course, everyone's sensitive right now to the fact that in some parts of the country simply had no chance to take no opportunity. So that wouldn't be fair to deny, some type of academic merit aid. But hopefully as the pandemic starts to recede and whatever, and kids have the opportunity. I mean, many colleges have been very blunt. Like, we're test optional. But if you're from a part of the country where you had the opportunity to take the SAT or ACT, we'd much prefer that you take the SAT or ACT, right? Like, we would prefer that you give us scores. But if you absolutely couldn't because there was no opportunity to take it, then we understand. I mean, that was in black and white on many college websites over this past year.
Mm-hmm. So I want to go back to the writing section. So the SAT is eliminating the writing. What do you see happening with the ACT in writing?
Yeah, I would be surprised if they keep the essay. I mean, and I the short version, I think we can keep this. I think it's a very interesting question, but I think we can keep it short in the sense that for years I've been advising families not to worry about the essay. I mean, before the College Board announced that they were doing away with the essay, I forget the number of colleges that were still requiring the SAT essay, but it was a very small number. I mean, the chances are you were going to apply to exactly 0 schools that required the SAT essay. Now, yeah, some schools said that, we'd like to see the essay or something like that. But so I think it's great that they did away with the essay, because honestly, it was very difficult to advise families about the essay, because I would say, I don't know if I would bother. And then the parent would say, but it's only 45 minutes. Like, why not just do the essay? This way we could check the box. And I'd say, yeah, I get that. So maybe just do it to be on the safe side, but it was just really annoying. So happy that they did away with it. It was a ridiculous exercise, right? The graders were only reading it for a couple of minutes, slapping a score on it. That's just silly. And I do expect the ACT to follow suit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The College Board has eliminated it. The ACT isn't going to keep it. And we used it for up until this past year, basically, because it was required by the University of California, as part of their application. And so we had to have our students take them, but now they don't have to do that. I want to go back to 1.2. Lauren made a mention that California is test blind, but they are not. That's where that whole definition of what test blind, test optional are. They are still using tests to identify the top 10%, the ELC students. And when we went to the UC counselor conferences in the fall, a lot of the UCs set up their own little indexes and things like that. And so yes, they said they're test blind, but it goes back to one of the other things. If you can put your test score on there and they see that, how can an admissions officer unsee those scores, right? So, and that's where, does test optional or test blind really mean test optional and test blind? As you said, sometimes you have to really look at what the websites say, because there are so many nuances to it, and it's hard. And if it's hard for us as professionals, how is it for students and parents and first generation students and students of color and, students with, other, different, learning differences, things like that? How are they supposed to navigate through all of this?
And that's what I think bothers all of us, right? Is that people are just like we're all inundated with news. People are just reading the headlines, but the headlines are really misinforming a lot of people. And I mean, you just said it, very, very articulately, Cindy, and like, you know, parent on some level, this is common sense. And the vast majority of parents I talk to are like, I don't care what anybody says. My son or my daughter wants to go to these competitive schools. They're taking the SAT or ACT, and I'm going to try to help them score as high as possible. Like basically, people are saying, I just don't buy it. I just don't buy and that's exactly to your point, Cindy. Like, I don't buy it that if my son or daughter doesn't bother submitting scores, they're going to have just as good a chance as a student with the exact same GPA who is submitting strong scores. And so and so pretty early on in this whole debate, I said to myself, I'm just going to focus. I'm going to go back to what I focused on for the last 22 years, which is helping students, helping families navigate this and score as well as possible. I did go onto my alma mater's website, and I feel typically Princeton does a decent job of communicating, but I was disappointed because Princeton had their policy for last year, for this year. But as I started to read sort of the sub pages in the admissions section, it started to get very vague to me. It started to get very unclear. And again, it's to your point, if you're just a parent sort of trying to read these web pages, I know if I was a parent and my son or daughter was hoping to apply to Princeton, I would have read these pages and my takeaway would have been, we better start preparing here. It's going to matter, so.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, but then, I mean, that goes back to, the whole issue of equity in general. I mean, what about families that can't afford to do the preparation? Somebody's asking, do you recommend like free programs? Like, is Khan Academy a good option to consider? And ACT has Kaplan. The test prep resources like you offer are very, you do a good job. You accomplish the goals and you're accomplishing what you're trying to do for your students, but not everybody has access to that. Are these other free resources, are they, can they be valuable? Can they be helpful?
Yeah. So Cindy, and you've known me for a long time, and we're a mission-based business. And I think some folks on this webinar know Method pretty well. My belief is every student should have access to high-quality test prep. And so we have 1,500 schools around the country that provide Method to every student at that school. So for families in those 1,500 schools, and of course, many of those schools are in low socioeconomic areas, effectively Method is free for those students. And I spend a tremendous amount of time with the Khan Academy with my son and my daughter. And just so everybody knows, this is something I get very passionate about. I have literally been on the Khan Academy every day for like the last 8 years. I think it's a phenomenal program for younger students. My son is in 6th grade. He's now doing like 9th grade math on the Khan Academy, just because the Khan Academy is such an amazing tool and it's such an efficient way to learn skills. The frustrating part about the SAT stuff on Khan Academy is when you get a question wrong, the video that plays doesn't explain that question. It's a video that's very well done in that realm, but it doesn't explain the question. So we've had a lot of students who have been frustrated using the Khan Academy because they want the video to explain that question. So the thing and again, this is not the purpose of the webinar, but we do have a lot of schools who say to us, Tom, we kind of consider Methods program free because it doesn't cost the school a lot of money. The cost for a school or an organization to purchase Method is very low. They say what we feel like we're paying for is the support because, of course, we pride ourselves on our support. And so if people have a question, we get right back to them. The Khan Academy, everybody understands it's an amazing resource, and I have such respect for the folks at the Khan Academy. But of course, they're not promising, phone support, or they're not promising training, things like this. So, and then the big thing is, Um, just getting a student to use one program is a challenge. If they have to go, I appreciate you laughing there, Cindy, because like as soon as I say to a school, if you're going to use Khan Academy for SAT and then you have to use AC Kaplan for ACT, now you have to make sure kids are going on two different programs. They're like, Tom, stop right there. That's a deal breaker. We're just going to, use method, and it's not going to cost us a lot. And, and then we're going to get SAT and ACT in one place. And, again, Cindy knows where my heart is. And so if nobody thinks it's fair that some families can't afford high quality educational resources. So we're committed to any student can take advantage of some of our programs. And again, the biggest one there is that we provide it to schools, and then it's available to everybody in that community.
Well, that's a very good, whoops, I just put in the wrong thing here. Shoot. Those are our questions for today. I was cutting and pasting Arlette's thing for the court and it didn't cut and paste. So, I think that's a very good answer, and that, you are offering tools and resources and service and to students through the schools, and that gives a lot more opportunities and equity and access. Jamie has a good question. So when do you advise students take the test? Let's put the pandemic aside for right now. As soon as they finished Algebra 2, I know that's what I've had to tell my students is like, by the time they get to be juniors in a much more advanced math, they have to go back and refresh their math from 8th grade because that's what's on the SAT. So what's the schedule you recommend?
Yeah, so I have a very specific answer to this, and apologize to Cindy because she's heard this before, but a lot of people kind of want to jot this down. So if you don't mind, here's my specific answer. Students should take the December ACT in their junior year. Why? Because you're paying extra $20. That's for the test information release service, the TIR, and the ACT sends the entire test back to you, so you can actually learn from your mistakes. And the way I explain it to families, and please feel free to explain it like this because I think it just sort of encapsulates it. Imagine taking a 4-hour exam, getting a score you're not completely satisfied with. No one tells you what you did wrong, and somebody says, go take that exam again. That's absurd, right? That I would never do that, and my son or my daughter is not going to do that. So what the timeline is pretty specific because they only offer this service on certain ACTs and certain SATs. So on the ACT, it's offered in December, April, and June. Those are the 3 ACTs that I think students should focus on. So, for example, you could take the ACT in December and then in April of your junior year, and hopefully that's it, you're done, because you're using what you did wrong in December. So that's the thing that I'm going to tell my son and my daughters. You're not taking the December ACT because it's ultimately going to be your best score. You're taking the December ACT, we're using it as a stepping stone. We're going to use it as a learning experience, and then you're going to score higher in April. Now, of course, you could use the same philosophy and do April and June. You won't have as much time to use your April results, but you can do April and June. And that kind of gets to the point of waiting till you're done with Algebra 2. And obviously for a lot of students, they're taking Algebra 2 in 11th grade. Now for the SAT, it's offered in March and May. Now the SAT calls theirs the question and answer service. And then it's also offered in October, which to me is a shame because October is really a test for seniors. I don't really want juniors taking the October SAT. So I advise families to think about the March and the May SATs so you can pay the extra $20 and you can see what you're doing wrong and you can learn from your mistakes. So that's the answer I feel is the best. Now, of course, the PSAT is a great resource because the PSAT, everybody automatically gets to see the questions that they answered incorrectly. So, for example, if any family is going to do an hour of tutoring, the most efficient way to use a tutor is to have a question and answer service or have a TIR service or have a PSAT, and then just provide that to the tutor beforehand, and then spend the entire hour just going through those questions. That is the most efficient way to significantly raise your score, even with just 1 hour of tutoring.
That's very good. Very good. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you especially to you, Tom, for your time. And sorry about the misunderstanding at times. I know when we're on total opposite coasts, the time zone can be a little confusing. But, and if someone has questions or they want to learn more, how do they reach you, Tom?
Yeah, so it's just, method. We're still at methodtestprep.com. And, just simple Google search. Our phone number is right there. My email, I'm going to share my email. It's just Tom at methodtestprep.com. And no, I appreciate you having me on, Cindy. I obviously appreciate everybody staying on for so long. And what happens a lot of times is people do have follow-up questions. And I would encourage anyone out there to purchase a sort of an organizational account with Method Test Prep. It can be as little as $350 or $450. So if you're working with a small group of students, you can provide them with access to my platform, at a very low upfront cost, so to speak. And so if anybody has a group of students that they want to provide some tools for, obviously just reach out to us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. And as I mentioned, our next interview, Friday Forum, it'll be in 2 weeks. So it'll be in March. And we're going to talk with Jenna Hartzell, and she's with the British Council of Education. And we're going to talk about the UK educational system and the UCAS. I have Gina Lester is going to come and talk about how she's increased her practice using online through this pandemic. So you'll want to listen to that. That'll be the end of March. And then in April, Sydney Montgomery and a couple of her colleagues are going to come and talk about the new equity index that they've launched. So I'll put this in, this will all be on my website, and I'll also put it in the notes. And I'm very excited to learn more and have you learn more about this equity index that she has put together. Tom, thank you very much. And I know there'll be much more opportunities. This is an ever-evolving story right now, right? So I'm sure we'll get a chance to cover this again.
It was my pleasure, Cindy. Thank you.
Well, and thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. This ends our Friday Forum for today.